They were told that dying was better than surrender. From the first day of basic training to the final desperate hours in caves and jungle outposts, they had been taught that capture meant eternal shame, that a true soldier chose death over the disgrace of becoming a prisoner. But on a warm September evening in 1945, 23 Japanese soldiers sat in a mess hall in California, staring at metal trays piled with more food than most had seen in months, and Takeshi Yamamoto felt tears running down his face before he could stop them. The shame of crying in front of others mixed with a different kind of shame, deeper and more confusing, as he looked at the mound of white rice, the portion of meat, the fresh vegetables, the slice of bread, all served by the same enemy who should have been starving, who they had been promised was weak and depleted and nearly broken. Before we continue with this story, if you're fascinated by these untold moments from history, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss these stories. And let me ask you something. What would you do if everything you had been taught to believe turned out to be wrong? How would you handle that moment when reality completely destroys what you thought was truth? The journey to this moment had begun weeks earlier, on islands whose names Takeshi could barely remember now, places that had become hell on earth. He had been pulled from a cave on Okinawa, more dead than alive, his body reduced to skin stretched over bones, his mind floating in and out of consciousness. He had expected execution. The propaganda had been clear about what Americans did to prisoners. They were demons, barbarians who tortured and killed without mercy, when the American medics had instead given him water, treated his wounds, carried him on a stretcher to a field hospital. His mind could not process the contradiction. Fever made everything unreal, so he told himself he was hallucinating, that death would come soon enough. But death had not come. Instead, there had been medicine, food, transport to a ship, more food, a long voyage across the Pacific, and finally arrival at a prisoner of war camp in California. At each stage, Takeshi waited for the cruelty to begin, for the Americans to reveal their true nature. At each stage, he was met instead with efficiency, with basic kindness, with treatment that violated everything he had been taught to expect. The confusion was almost worse than torture would have been. Torture he could have understood. This strange mercy left him unmoored, uncertain, ashamed in ways that had no name. The camp was not what he had imagined. There were fences and guards, yes, but the barracks were clean, the facilities adequate. The guards mostly bored young men who seemed to view their duty as a routine job rather than a chance for revenge. Takeshi and the others were processed, given medical examinations, issued new clothes to replace the rags they had worn. The American doctor who examined him spoke through a translator, asking about his health, noting his severe malnutrition, prescribing rest and a gradual return to normal eating. The doctor's manner was professional, almost indifferent, as if Takeshi were simply a patient rather than an enemy. This too was confusing. Where was the hatred? Where was the revenge? The first meal came that evening. The prisoners were led to the mess hall in groups, and Takeshi shuffled along with the others, his new clothes hanging loose on his wasted frame. The building smelled of cooking, and the scent alone made him dizzy. Real food, meat and bread, and something sweet he could not identify. They had been eating grass and roots and whatever insects they could find in those final weeks on Okinawa. Before that, rations had been reduced to almost nothing. A ball of rice, if they were lucky, thin soup made from whatever could be scrounged. The smell of actual cooking was so foreign it seemed like a memory from childhood, from a different life entirely. They were each given a metal tray, the kind American soldiers used, divided into sections. The men serving the food were Americans, regular soldiers doing kitchen duty, and they scooped portions without comment or expression. Rice, white and fluffy, not the moldy scraps they had choked down in the jungle. A piece of meat, some kind of beef, cooked and seasoned. Vegetables, recognizable carrots and potatoes. Bread, soft and fresh. A small portion of canned peaches in syrup. Takeshi stared at his tray and felt his hands begin to shake. Around him, the other prisoners stood frozen, holding their trays, uncertain what to do. Permission to sit came from a guard who seemed puzzled by their hesitation. They found seats at long tables, moving like men in a dream. Takeshi set his tray down carefully, afraid it might disappear if he handled it too roughly. The steam rose from the rice, carrying a scent that pulled at something deep in his memory. Home. His mother's cooking. A time before the war had consumed everything. He picked up the fork they had been given, an American utensil that felt awkward in his hand. Around him, some of the men were already eating, shoveling food into their mouths with desperate hunger, while others sat motionless, staring. Takeshi brought a small amount of rice to his mouth. The taste exploded across his tongue, simple and perfect and devastating. He had forgotten that food could taste like this, that rice could be anything other than a joyless necessity for survival. He took another bite, then another, and then he could not stop the tears that came, silent and humiliating. He was not alone. Across the table, Private Sato was crying openly, his face buried in his hands, his shoulders shaking. Next to him, Corporal Fujita ate with tears streaming down his face, not bothering to wipe them away. The act of eating this food, this abundant, well-prepared food given to them by the enemy, was breaking something inside all of them. It was not just the relief of hunger being satisfied. It was not just the physical comfort of a full stomach after so long. It was the meaning of this food, what it represented, what it said about everything they had believed. They had been told America was starving. The military newspapers had shown photographs of bread lines and riots, had reported that the American economy was collapsing under the weight of the war, that civilians suffered while their government poured resources into a fight it could not win. The propaganda had been detailed and consistent. America was weak, divided, on the verge of internal collapse. Japan would triumph through superior spirit, through the warrior code that made each Japanese soldier worth 10 Americans. This was what they had been taught, what they had believed, what had made sense of their suffering. But this food told a different story. This food, served casually on a Tuesday evening to prisoners of war, suggested resources so deep that feeding enemies was barely worth noting. The rice alone was better than what Takeshi had eaten in the Imperial Army even in the early days of the war. The meat was more than most Japanese civilians had seen in years. And this was prison food, the minimum required, given without ceremony or celebration. What did Americans eat when they sat down to their own dinners? What abundance existed beyond these fences if prisoners ate like this? The cultural weight of the meal went deeper than simple nutrition. In Japanese culture, food was never just food. It carried meaning, expressed relationships, demonstrated care and respect. A mother's love was measured in the meals she prepared. A host's regard for guests showed in the quality of what was served. To give someone food was to acknowledge their humanity, their worth. The Americans, by feeding them well, were making a statement that Takeshi's mind struggled to accept. They were saying, in the language of meals, that even defeated enemies deserved basic dignity. This was not the action of demons or barbarians. This was something else entirely. Over the following days, the meals continued, each one as substantial as the first. Breakfast brought oatmeal with milk and sugar, toast with butter, coffee that was real coffee rather than the burnt barley water they had drunk in the army. Lunch was soup and sandwiches, quantities that seemed impossible. Dinner repeated the pattern of that first evening: protein, starch, vegetables, sometimes dessert. The prisoners began to gain weight, their bodies slowly recovering from months and years of deprivation. But the psychological impact of this feeding was harder to measure and more troubling to process. Takeshi found himself thinking constantly about the food, not just eating it but trying to understand it. The camp must feed hundreds of prisoners, maybe thousands. The food had to come from somewhere, had to be transported and stored and prepared. The logistics alone suggested an infrastructure that contradicted everything he had been taught about American weakness. And this was just one camp. There were others, feeding German prisoners and Italian prisoners and Japanese prisoners across the country, while also feeding American troops on battlefields around the world, while also, presumably, feeding American civilians at home. The mathematics did not work if America was starving. The numbers only made sense if America had abundance to spare. He tried to talk about this with Sato one evening after dinner. They sat in the barracks, in the hour before lights out, speaking quietly in the shadows. "Where does it all come from?" Takeshi asked. "The food. Every day, so much food. Where does it come from?" Sato was silent for a long time before answering. "I have been thinking the same thing. We were told they were starving. But people who are starving do not feed prisoners like this. They cannot." The words hung between them, dangerous and undeniable. To say them aloud was to admit they had been deceived. And if they had been lied to about American food supplies, what else had been lies? The question spread through the camp like a fever, whispered in corners, discussed in careful euphemisms. The prisoners were not stupid. They could see the evidence before them, could feel it in their recovering bodies, could taste it in every meal. But accepting what that evidence meant required abandoning beliefs that had shaped their entire adult lives. The emperor was divine. Japan's cause was righteous. The military leadership was honorable and truthful. To doubt the propaganda about American starvation was to begin doubting everything else, and that path led to a darkness that was terrifying to contemplate. Some men refused to walk that path. Private Nakamura ate the food but insisted it was a trick, that the Americans were fattening them up for some cruel purpose, that the abundance was temporary and meant to confuse them. Others, like Sato, began quietly questioning everything they had been taught, picking apart memories of propaganda and finding lies where they had once seen only truth. Takeshi found himself somewhere in between, unable to maintain his old certainties but afraid of what would replace them. The camp administrators began showing movies once a week, projected against a white sheet in the mess hall. American films, propaganda in their own way, designed to show the prisoners what they had been fighting against. Newsreels of American factories producing tanks and aircraft, footage of American farms harvesting wheat that stretched to the horizon, images of American cities, intact and functioning, showing no signs of starvation or collapse. Takeshi watched these films with a sick feeling in his stomach. If even half of what they showed was true, Japan had never had a chance. The war had been lost before it began, a hopeless fight against an opponent whose resources dwarfed Japan's so completely that all the warrior spirit in the world could not overcome the gap. One film showed American supermarkets, civilians shopping for food from shelves stocked with more variety than Takeshi had seen in his entire life. Canned goods and fresh produce and meat and dairy and bread and cereals, all available to ordinary people, priced at amounts that seemed impossible. An American worker, the narrator said, could buy a week's worth of food with a day's wages. Takeshi did the mathematics in his head, comparing to what he knew of life in Japan. It did not compute. The scales were too different. If this was true, if Americans really lived like this, then the war had been not just a military mistake but a cosmic delusion. After the movie, the prisoners filed back to the barracks in heavy silence. No one wanted to speak what they were all thinking. In the darkness, someone finally said, "My family is starving in Osaka. My mother's last letter said they were eating sweet potato vines. And Americans throw away more food than my family sees in a month." The voice broke on the last words. No one responded because there was nothing to say. The truth was too large and too painful to fit into words. Takeshi lay on his bunk and thought about his own family in Hiroshima. He had not heard from them since before his capture, did not know if they had survived the bombing that he had learned about from whispered rumors in the camp. Hiroshima, gone in a flash of light. Nagasaki, erased. Cities full of civilians, vaporized by weapons that seemed like something from a nightmare. And if those weapons were real, if the whispered numbers of the dead were even close to accurate, then the Americans had possessed power beyond imagination, while Japanese propaganda had insisted they were weak. The lies had killed his friends, had maybe killed his family, had certainly killed hundreds of thousands who had believed they were fighting for a cause that had any hope of victory. The weight of those lies was crushing. Takeshi had been a good soldier. He had believed in the emperor, in the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, in Japan's divine mission. He had fought bravely, had followed orders without question, had been willing to die rather than surrender. Only starvation and unconsciousness had prevented him from choosing death as he had been taught. And now, eating bread and meat in a California prison camp, watching movies about American abundance, he had to face the possibility that his courage had been wasted, his faith misplaced, his suffering in service of nothing but lies. The food kept coming, 3 times a day, relentless in its abundance. Takeshi's body grew stronger, his mind clearer, his confusion deeper. The Americans did not gloat or lecture. They simply fed the prisoners, treated minor ailments, maintained order with minimal force, and went about their business with a casualness that was itself a kind of statement. This was normal for them. This abundance, this infrastructure, this system that could feed thousands of prisoners without apparent strain. This was just how America functioned. It was not a special effort or a propaganda show. It was simply reality. In October, the Red Cross arranged for letters to be sent home. Takeshi sat with paper and pen for hours, trying to decide what to write. How could he explain what he had learned? How could he tell his family, if they were even alive to read it, that everything they had been told was wrong? He settled finally for simple facts, describing the camp, the food, the treatment. We eat rice every day, white rice, as much as we want. There is meat and vegetables. The guards do not beat us. I am gaining weight and recovering my health. These sentences, bland and factual, were themselves a kind of revolution. They said, without saying directly, that the enemy was not what they had been taught to expect. Some prisoners began to study English, using materials provided by the camp education program. The Americans seemed to believe that education would prevent future wars, that understanding between cultures could replace hatred. Takeshi joined the classes, partly from boredom, partly from a growing curiosity about these people who had defeated Japan so completely. The teacher was a Nisei, a Japanese-American soldier whose parents had immigrated to California decades earlier. This man's existence raised questions Takeshi did not know how to ask. He looked Japanese but spoke English as his native tongue, wore an American uniform, seemed comfortable in his dual identity. In Japan, such mixing of cultures was seen as weakness. But this man did not seem weak. He seemed content, adjusted, comfortable in a way that suggested the American model of many cultures existing together might actually work. The English lessons gave Takeshi access to American newspapers, censored but still revealing. He read about the occupation of Japan, about the reforms being imposed, about the food aid being sent to prevent starvation, American aid. To Japan, to the enemy that had attacked Pearl Harbor and committed atrocities across Asia. The same America that was feeding him in this camp was now feeding civilians in Tokyo and Osaka, sending grain and supplies to prevent mass starvation. His mind could not reconcile the propaganda image of cruel barbarians with this reality of comprehensive mercy. Mercy was not weakness, he began to understand. Mercy from a position of total victory was perhaps the ultimate demonstration of strength. Christmas came, and the camp administrators organized a celebration that seemed to assume the Japanese prisoners would want to participate in this Christian holiday. They were given special meals, turkey and stuffing and pies made from real fruit. Gifts were distributed, small items purchased with camp funds, soap, writing paper, candy. The guards seemed to expect gratitude, but Takeshi felt only a deeper confusion. Why? Why this effort, this expense, this care for people who had so recently been trying to kill Americans? The only answer he could find was that Americans believed in these rituals of humanity, believed that even enemies deserved some recognition of shared human experience. This belief system was so foreign to the Japanese military culture, he had known that it might as well have been alien. In the new year, some prisoners became eligible for work programs, leaving the camp during the day to labor on nearby farms or in factories, earning small wages and contributing to their own support. Takeshi volunteered, desperate for something to do beyond sitting and thinking and feeling his old certainties crumble. He was assigned to a farm growing vegetables, working alongside American civilians and Mexican laborers in fields that stretched for acres. The farm owner, a man named Johnson, treated him with neither friendship nor hostility, simply as a worker who needed to do his job properly. At lunch, they all ate together, sandwiches and fruit and cold water, sitting in the shade of a barn. Johnson asked him, through a translator, about farming in Japan. Takeshi described the small rice paddies of his childhood, the intensive labor, the careful management of every inch of soil. Johnson nodded and talked about his own operation, the machinery that let him farm hundreds of acres with just a handful of workers, the irrigation systems, the fertilizers that boosted yields beyond what traditional methods could achieve. The scale was different, the methods were different, everything was different. But in the act of comparing agricultural practices, of talking about soil and water and crops, Takeshi felt something shift. They were just farmers, in that moment, discussing the universal challenges of growing food. The war seemed distant, almost irrelevant. The food from the farm, fresh vegetables that went to markets and eventually to tables across California, was better than what they ate in the camp. Johnson sometimes gave the workers produce to take back with them, tomatoes still warm from the sun, lettuce crisp and green, strawberries sweet enough to make Takeshi close his eyes with pleasure. He thought about the journey these vegetables would take, from this field to a market to an American family's dinner table, and about the parallel journey of food to the camp, feeding prisoners who should have been enemies but were instead just hungry men being fed. The system that made all this possible, the farms and trucks and markets and distribution networks, this was not weakness. This was strength of a kind Japan had never developed, infrastructure rather than ideology. Spring came to California with a gentleness that reminded Takeshi of home. Cherry blossoms bloomed in a park near the camp, and the guards allowed prisoners to walk there under supervision. Takeshi stood beneath the blossoms and felt tears come again. Not from shame this time, but from a more complex mixture of loss and beauty and painful understanding. These trees, Japanese trees, growing in American soil, blooming in this place so far from home. They had adapted, had found a way to survive and even thrive in foreign earth. Perhaps he would need to do the same. News from Japan filtered into the camp through letters and newspapers. The occupation was proceeding, reforms being implemented, the country being rebuilt under American supervision. The emperor had announced he was not divine, a statement so shocking that many prisoners refused to believe it. The entire structure of Japanese society was being dismantled and rebuilt according to American principles. Democracy, human rights, land reform, women's suffrage, concepts that had been foreign or forbidden were now being imposed by force. Takeshi did not know how to feel about any of it. The Japan he had known was gone, replaced by something new and uncertain. Perhaps that was necessary. Perhaps that was the only path forward. In the summer, repatriation began. The process was slow, complicated by the logistics of transport and the chaos in Japan. Takeshi was not in the first groups. He waited, suspended between worlds, no longer quite Japanese in the way he had been, but not American either. The camp had become familiar, almost comfortable. He knew the routines, the guards, the other prisoners. He had gained weight, learned English, developed skills from his farm work. He was healthier and better educated than when he had been captured. This too was strange, this improvement that came from defeat and captivity. When his turn finally came in October 1946, Takeshi packed his few possessions into a bag the camp had provided. He had the clothes he wore, some personal items, a small amount of money earned from his work, more than he had owned when he was pulled from that cave on Okinawa. The journey back across the Pacific was long and gave him time to think about what he would find, how he would explain what he had learned, who he had become. Japan from the ship looked smaller than he remembered, the cities still showing the scars of bombing, the people thin and tired. He landed at Yokohama and moved through the repatriation process in a daze. His family, he learned, had survived Hiroshima, had been in the countryside when the bomb fell. This news, delivered by a Red Cross worker, made him sit down suddenly, overwhelmed by relief. They were alive. His mother, his two sisters, his younger brother, alive and waiting for him. The reunion, when it finally happened, was tearful and painful and filled with things that could not be said. They were thinner than he remembered, marked by hardship, but alive. They fed him what they could, a small meal of rice and vegetables and pickles, apologizing for its meagerness. Takeshi ate and remembered the camp food, the abundance he had experienced for more than a year, the meals that had broken him and rebuilt him. He could not tell them about those meals. How could he explain that the enemy had fed him better than his own army had, better than his own country could now? How could he describe the plenty he had seen without seeming to betray everything Japan was supposed to be? But in the months that followed, as he tried to build a life in the ruins, Takeshi found himself returning again and again to the lessons of those meals. Food was not just food. It was a measure of systems, of values, of what a society could achieve. Japan had chosen military expansion and spiritual purity and the warrior code. America had chosen industrial production and material abundance and systematic efficiency. The results of that choice were written in the bombed cities and starving civilians and comprehensive defeat that surrounded him, but also, perhaps, in the opportunity to start again, to build something different, to learn from the bitter lessons that had been bought with so much blood. He got work helping with reconstruction, using the agricultural skills he had developed in California. The American occupation authorities were pushing for land reform, breaking up the old estates, distributing land to farmers who would actually work it. Takeshi saw in these reforms echoes of the abundance he had witnessed. Give people ownership, give them incentive, give them the tools to succeed, and productivity would follow. It was not the Japanese way, or at least not the old Japanese way, but the old way had led to disaster. Perhaps the new way, foreign and uncomfortable as it felt, would lead somewhere better. Years later, when Japan's economy began to grow, when supermarkets started appearing in Tokyo and Osaka stocked with goods that would have seemed impossible in those hungry years after the war, Takeshi would think of his first meal in that California camp. The taste of white rice, the tears that came unbidden, the shame and wonder and confusion that had marked the beginning of his understanding. That meal had been more than just food. It had been an education, a revelation, a moment when reality crashed through propaganda and forced him to see the world as it actually was rather than as he had been taught to believe. The memory never fully faded. It remained with him as a kind of touchstone, a reminder that certainty could be dangerous, that what you knew could be wrong, that the enemy might not be what you expected. The Americans had defeated Japan with bombs and bullets, yes, but they had also defeated Japanese ideology with abundance, with the casual plenty that made mockery of propaganda about starvation and weakness. They had defeated it with the simple act of feeding prisoners decent meals, with the mercy that came from strength rather than weakness, with the demonstration that their system, for all its flaws, could produce results that the Japanese system could not match. It was not the military defeat that had broken him, but the kindness, not the bombs, but the bread, not the force, but the food. These things had shattered his understanding and forced him to rebuild it from the ground up, to question everything he had believed and find new truths to replace the old lies. That process had been painful, more painful in some ways than combat had been, but it had also been necessary, the first step toward wisdom, toward understanding, toward a future that might actually work. And there were thousands more stories like these waiting to be told.